I'm excited. It is Thursday, January 20th, and this has been a momentous month, I think, for anyone involved in politics and media. And I'm very excited to have Lomez back on the podcast to discuss all the latest happenings. But you are actually back from the dead. What happened since I saw you a couple weeks ago in D.C.?
The deep state. They're attacking me. They're attacking MAGA patriots. Everybody who was back for these inaugurations, like everybody I've talked to got sick or a little bit sick, and there's like a horrible flu virus going around, or they got us with the Havana gun. That's my working theory. But I'm slightly in recovery mode. I have this ongoing, lingering brain fog. So this is my excuse for any stupid thing I say, or if I'm just like sputtering and not making sense, being totally incoherent. It's not my fault. I got hit with the Havana gun. I'm taking methylene blue. That's what all the bros on Twitter are telling me to take to resolve my brain fog.
Oh, God.
Have you ever done methylene blue?
I haven't, but it's like a fabric dye. Is that what the original use was?
Yeah. And it like dyes your tongue, and it's supposed to do something like to your neural pathways. I also got this special like mushroom. I'm become, in honor of Maha, in honor of RFK's hearings. I'm taking these homeopathic drugs. I'm taking this like mushroom. It's like 17 different mushroom supplements that's supposed to resolve my brain hangover from this flu. So,
and part of it is just like after 40, you have to really believe in esoteric medical cures.
Yeah.
Because every hangover, every flu, every sniffle becomes like an existential crisis, and you have a lot relying on you. And
yes.
So you got to figure out something. So all right, well,
let
me know.
Also, just like natural IQ decline, that's also happening. And I'm just like masking that with these excuses about getting sick.
Yeah, and nootropics. But this has been, an immense couple weeks. I know that as we were talking leading up to the inauguration, there was this open question of what is it going to be? Is this going to be Trump 1.0 recycled? Is the left going to, kind of riot and blitz through the streets? Is he going to actually take action on all these promises he's made? And I mean, the answer, at least from my perspective, has been an overwhelming, all of the above, yes. Trump, and I watched the planning for this over the last few years with friends that were in the first administration, that have been in Trump's orbit planning for the potential second administration. But it still came as a shock, even though I, in some ways, knew what was coming. How did you see it? I mean, what has been your big takeaway or reaction from the last week?
Yeah, so this has been a period of 10 days since the inauguration of as heightened political energy, focused political energy as I've ever seen in this country, with one exception, and it's this exact same period 8 years ago in 2017. But it was the exact opposite, which is the left activating itself to fight back against literally everything that Trump was doing. And so, if you go back and like just read through the Wikipedia articles about what was happening at this time 8 years ago, there were like protests every day, millions of people in the streets. This is when, the hashtag resistance starts. This is when the Women's March is happening in cities across the country. I looked it up. So the Washington Post, it was February 17th that they unveil, democracy dies in darkness, their big like resistance hashtag, their rebranding, like anti-Trump rebranding. You have the beginnings really of the formal Russiagate scandal. At this point, it was, the 17 agencies signing off, telling us that Russia interfered in our election, which is, of course, like meant to justify all of this leftist energy to neuter anything Trump might do as a political matter. And so what's happened now is like that is gone. That is completely gone. It's completely absent from the discourse. And I'm curious to hear what you think about this. I mean, I sort of saw this coming previously. My hunch was before the election that the left was out of energy, and these activist groups did not have the ability to coordinate or activate their people on the ground who would show up in the freezing cold. They're just out of ideas. Nobody really cares. And I don't want to skip too far ahead, but this is what Curtis Yarvin wrote about in his essay, which is the difference now and why he was wrong and you were right. We'll get into that, is because the left is out of energy. They're lacking this moral energy. I think there's some other stuff going on, and it's not just that the left has deactivated. There's something different in character about this Trump administration. It's the administration of you can just do things, and they're just doing things. But obviously there's been a ton of planning that's gone into this, a ton of foresight. And I don't know, if it's Stephen Miller or who are the people responsible for being ready to seize this moment, but they've obviously been preparing for a long time. And the moment the inauguration happened, they immediately went into action. And this has been something I've never seen on the right. It makes me wonder what Republicans have been doing my entire life up till now. And so, what's the difference? Like, what do you think the essential difference is between Trump's administration at this point in his inner circle and why they've been so effective in these last 10 days versus 2017?
Yeah, I mean, first, I think you're right on the kind of inversion of political energy, and it's so funny. One of the projects I really worked on, 2 projects since the summer. One was this project of preparing a kind of policy vision and agenda, and working with people if there were to be a second Trump administration. But the other smaller project I was working on, I had a patron provide some generous support for hiring a team of ex-CIA and ex-FBI analysts. And they were essentially doing the initial research for some reporting on the left-wing militant groups around D.C. And the thesis from our team essentially was, if there's a contested election, and this contested election spills over into kind of a physical contestation in D.C., riots, conflicts, etc., the left has a built-in advantage because the left has an organized kind of protest network. And so we wanted to trace the funding, the organization, the personalities, and the potential force projection of these groups. And we had these guys studying it, and then I did some reporting and had another reporter working on it. And it was this big apparatus that we were able to uncover, and then seemingly it disappeared, it dissipated. They couldn't mobilize anyone. And so it's interesting because you have these formal institutions on the left, and organizations and trainings and rhetoric, but they're almost entirely dependent on public energy. And so, 2016 or 2020, they were able to kind of ride the wave. But when that energy dissipates, it's a totally different story. And on the other side, on the Trump side, I think certainly it's Stephen Miller, amazing. It's a lot of the people at AFPI, the America First Policy Institute, which was chaired by Linda McMahon, now Education Secretary. Yeah. But they had a huge team, and essentially what it was an administration in waiting. And these guys were there doing the detailed planning, policy writing, workshopping ideas. And then, of course, Russ Vaught's group, he's now the director of Office of Management and Budget. He had a group called Center for Renewing America. And his whole focus was, how do we get rid of the woke and weaponized bureaucracy? And so this group of people who were really kind of thrust together in the first term in a totally chaotic manner had a chance to retreat, regroup, start actually planning. And the question among the policy team, up until, right before the inauguration, and I was asking them this because I really wanted to know, was I said, well, what's the likelihood that the president greenlights all of these ideas that you've been coming up with for 4 years? And they said, of course, on background, can't attribute any names. They said, look, the president is an instinctual creature, and we don't even know. We have no idea what he's going to do. But apparently, the president was just like smashing the green button. Just, we're going to do everything. And so I think that's what you're seeing. You're seeing years of preparation, and then the president, I'm sure, given all that he's gone through, says, we're not going to play this time. This is actually a real presidency. There was a almost a feeling like he was even surprised the first time around that he was president.
Yeah.
Now he's not surprised by any measure. The guy's earned it, and he wants to make something out of it.
Yeah, I mean, this is like what you're saying here and describing obviously is playing out in ways that we can see. And like, I'm thinking of the J6 pardons, for example. I remember hearing some anecdote where there was this like back and forth. Okay, who are we going to pardon? And like, what is the threshold for whatever they were accused of doing, whether there was some like violence involved? Maybe they'll stay, but the others will get pardoned. And at some point, Trump is like, forget it. Just forget all of this like nitpicking. Just do the whole thing at once. Like, just pardon all of them. And yeah, okay, some like nuance gets lost in the shuffle there. And this certainly seems to upset, these like liberal centrists who want everything to be so precise. But I'm sort of glad Trump has just said, forget it. Just do everything. Just throw like the entire sink at it and see what sticks. And there's no resistance. There doesn't seem to be much resistance to anything. So I'm wondering, to get back to this research project you were engaged in the summer with these activist networks. One is, I'm curious, why did they just disappear? Was this like, did the Gaza thing really just like split the leftist coalition in half and then they couldn't come together? Is that part of it? Or does like the money dry up? Or is it that the media environment now doesn't have the sort of rhetorical firepower to get like your just average person up into enough of a state of like high dudgeon to get out and, do something in the street? And then my other question to you would be is, okay, this is all great. If I'm being a pessimist, I'm not a pessimist. I'm actually like more optimistic than I've ever been. But if I was being a pessimist, what I would say is, okay, this is all great, but there's going to be a Hawaiian judge. This was like the thing in 2017. Some judge just comes out of nowhere, strikes down whatever Trump wants to do. We saw this a little bit in Seattle with the deportation order. There was some judge in Seattle. So does the Trump team, are they as prepared on the legal side as they have been with these executive orders and this initial thrust to get stuff done? Do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, I don't have particular insight, but I suppose that they are. I mean, the conservative establishment, you and I have critiques of it. But what's really clear is that the conservative legal establishment is strong, it's well organized, it's emboldened. And so they'll have a deep reservoir of talent to draw on. And I think they're going to be much more aggressive. And I think the left, here's my theory of where things might be going. We have this vibe shift, which is undeniable and it's real. The question is it a deeper shift or is it evanescent? Is it something that's going to disappear as the kind of honeymoon wears off? Let's do not the pessimistic, but the most optimistic reading. Is that, no, this is a durable shift. Mm-hmm. And that answers the question of, well, what happens to the kind of left-wing, protest movement? Well, the left-wing protest movement, they need BLM, they need COVID, they need, Trump hysteria V1, they need, the pussy hat era. And when that has exhausted itself, there's nothing they can really gather. And, probably when you and I were young, and, you'd go to like UC Berkeley's campus, you'd go on Telegraph Ave, and you'd see these groups of weird, political radicals with their little red Chairman Mao books or their Lyndon LaRouche tables. And it's like, can we just get the left back to that? Yeah. Where they have so little purchase in the culture that they're like, like smoking spliffs and they're like white dudes with dreadlocks, selling Chairman Mao's little red book on Telegraph Avenue. Like, I'm happy with that. That's a left that I can live with. And it's possible that we could be trending in that direction. It's not inevitable, a million caveats. But they tried, and we had these guys monitoring these groups, and they said, look, they are trying everything they can. They tried to latch on to the kind of anti-Israel, pro-Hamas, pro-Gaza movement. They tried to hybridize that with the BLM movement, and it just never hooked, because the fact is that most people don't care what's happening in the Middle East. I mean, they can get worked up abstractly maybe, but it's not visceral like, a BLM or something. even a Me Too, which people felt like impacted them personally. You could motivate people. And so I don't know. I mean, what do you think? Is this are we being naive and foolish? Are we being over optimistic? What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to make any like long-term predictions, but over the short, medium term, because these things will be cyclical. Like there will be, what you mentioned was like they need something to rally around, and they used to be able to invent the occasion for that kind of activism. So like BLM was just sort of created out of thin air. Okay, there wasn't like we had like the Trayvon case or the Michael Brown case, and then Ferguson blows up, and then you got George Floyd. This stuff was just kind of invented, and in each of those cases, they like tried other flashpoint stories to sort of activate people, and they just didn't take. And I think they're just kind of out of bullets when it comes to those sorts of stories. There isn't then this other kind of exogenous event that they can latch onto, like COVID, for example. The Israel thing is super complicated for them because of how that splits this sort of leftist coalition, and a lot of the Jewish groups that aren't comfortable going along with the Hamas stuff. It's just very uncomfortable for someone, I'm sure, like George Soros to be giving money to people, in opposition to Israel. So that's just turned out to be a total disaster for them. And then, so what are their other causes? Like climate change? Is that really like energizing people? No, we see like they're throwing paint at, these, paintings or whatever, and just being ridiculous. They look totally foolish. There's no organic energy around that. There's no like Occupy Wall Street kind of class-based, event that they can rally around. Maybe there's something in like tech world that they'll find. Maybe AI will be the thing that there's some schism that they can take one side of. But all the stuff they have right now, trans, BLM stuff, all of the criminal reform stuff that they tried to push over the last 4 years is just dead. And nobody cares. Normies do not care about this stuff. Your average like suburbanite, your average person who is not politically active, even if they don't like Trump, is completely sick of this stuff. I think we talked a little bit about that last time, but there's just no energy for any of this stuff. So yeah, I think the left activist class goes into this dormant period for a while. I mean, the other thing here is, and this will dovetail on something else I'm sure we'll talk about, they don't have the cultural cachet that they once did. So even when the left was just complaining on Berkeley campuses, and they were doing like protests against nuclear dumping sites in Nevada or something, that was like their big thing. They at least were making really good music, and they were making like cool movies and writing novels, and they owned utterly the culture. They owned utterly sort of what it meant to be edgy and cool and avant-garde and young and hip and countercultural. They don't own the counterculture anymore. So that other pillar of leftist power is also completely gone. So like, yeah, I'm sitting here talking myself into like, a long-term, conservative ownership. I think what I'd say to that is, okay, what is actually binding us though? Like Trump is not ideological. I tell people this all the time. I'm like, he's not on the right, okay? He's a pragmatist. He's just doing what works. So the question is then not, is the left going to anytime soon aggregate any real cultural or political power? I don't think so. I think that's dormant for a while. The question is, can the right sustain its own sort of self-authorizing movement that doesn't depend on like leftist institutions like academia or the New York Times or New York Magazine for that matter to legitimize what we're doing? Can we just do this stuff and gain status out of it and confer coolness out of it on our own? That's the open question.
That is, and I think that one of the good symbols of this question this week was a New York Magazine cover. And the New York Magazine cover was from some right-wing inauguration party, certainly not as cool as the Passage Press party that you threw, but it did look cool. And it was this kind of this large format, high angle picture of, you know, young, they cropped out the 3 black people in the frame. Yeah. So it was like young, you know, attractive, conservative, MAGA kids dressed in tuxes and suits and drinking. And it was kind of this glittering, almost, it gave me a kind of a 1920s feel, which was really cool. And then there were these other close-up shots that the photographer had lit from underneath with a flashbulb underneath to make them look kind of grotesque and frightening, but it actually just gave them a bit more stylization. And so let's say like the middle argument on this image was, the title was The Cruel Kids Table, like a play on the idea of the cool kids table. Like, oh, it looks cool, but they're actually bad people. That's kind of the dumb argument that is the basis of most kind of progressive thought over the last 10 years. But right-wingers looked at it and they said, actually, no, this is just cool. We are young, we're attractive, we're aesthetically appealing, we're throwing great parties. This is no longer, grandpa's, country club conservatism. This is the kind of new right depicted in this cover. And even when they attack us, they can't help but make us look cool. Was that your take, or was that part of your take? How did you look at this? I'm curious.
Yeah. I mean, it's good. It's good to look cool. Like in our event, I'll just say too, we had these, it was featured in GQ, and there are these pictures of us in our tuxes drinking champagne and having a good time. And it's like, it's young, attractive people on the right having fun. It's not like your stuffed shirt, sort of like think tank party. It's something totally different. Unique to the right, at least in our lifetimes. And this is great. These images are great and they're incredibly powerful. And this also coincides with, I don't know if you saw, James Pogue wrote a 10,000 word or more piece for Vanity Fair. And it was like, what happened to the Democrats? And it's Pogue's long form sort of journey throughout the Kamala Harris, Tim Walz campaign, going to these different Democratic functions and a few right-wing functions and doing this sort of like compare and contrast. Vanity Fair, of course, is no friend to the right, but in this piece, Pogue describes, being at this Democrat party, and it's like this, he describes this fat young man like sweating in this black suit, like this grotesque image, insisting that it's cool to care about democracy, and he's like, put that in your article. What's cool is caring about the integrity of our democracy. Yeah. And then you juxtapose that
trans kids are the coolest thing ever. Right? Yeah.
So you're just picturing this like slovenly guy in a suit sweating, saying that to James Pogue at the Democrat Party, and then that's juxtaposed with this like glittering, glamorous image of the right wingers. This is great. Okay. And it's true. Okay. This does like map onto the reality of how young people are now participating with politics and these different coded sort of social and cultural scenes. The problem is, and you pointed this out, I think in a tweet, I think it was your tweet, that we can't rely though on Vanity Fair and New York Magazine to be the ones to tell us that this is what's happening, and to like formalize in the public conscious that what's cool is what Vanity Fair and New York Magazine even unwittingly tells you is cool, and what they tell you is cringe and boring is what's cringe and boring. The right, if we're going to have any kind of sustained cultural power, has to have our own, again, self-authorizing cultural institutions. Obviously, this is something we're trying to do, with Passage, but how does that work? Like, how do we reclaim not just being cool, but the ones who get to say what is and is not cool, what is and is not high status, et cetera?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, look, the cultural right is ascendant, but it's still not crystallized into anything concrete. And the left has given us an opportunity. The left forfeited status, forfeited prestige, forfeited aesthetic beauty, forfeited, most of the kind of the media production industries. Like, with your Passage publishing, you're sensing an opportunity that when they started doing sensitivity readers at the Big Five, when they started, kind of policing all of the, young adult fiction, even for kind of faux pas against the kind of woke consensus, they're creating an opportunity for us. But it's not clear that we can seize it, and it's not clear that we can produce that kind of cultural comment ourselves. And eventually, Vanity Fair is going to get bored or envious, or their hatred will spring again, and they'll start just doing nothing but smear pieces like they had been previously. And so the question is, can the right do this? And I see that even in the journalism field, certainly in the arts and culture field. I can rattle off a dozen writers at the New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, Vanity Fair, whatever, that even like taking all the ideology out, taking all of the kind of true false out, just the craft of it is very skilled, very high quality. We don't have an equivalent roster on the right quite yet. And then we don't have the publications that can convey that, right? And so I know I'm trying to do that in my small way. I think City Journal, where I am writing, can be a venue for long form commentary pieces, but it's more of a policy magazine. What we need beyond that is these culture magazines. I think what you're doing is very important. I think what Mark Granza is doing at IM 1776 is very important. But the kind of modal right-wing influencer is still cat turd, is still the kind of partisan boomer slop that just like goes for the kind of algorithmic maximization. There's no care on aesthetics. One of the things that came out simultaneously as this cover was this like ultra right beer calendar. I don't know if you saw this. It's like a right wing beer company. They put out a calendar with like right wing babes, and it was just so bad. It's like the lighting, the costume, the design, it's like really bad, like high school kid photography. That is like, it's like, this is not going to take us to that place that we need to go.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like special pleading here because I have this like company, we have these media properties, we have books and magazines, and we're starting in, video media as well. And so like what I'm going to say is, we need money. Give us money. Give me a bunch of money so I can start cultivating some talent and start experimenting with some of these projects. And if you're rich and on the right and you care about this stuff, you should be putting money into culture. I'm not the first person to say this, but that's part of the equation. And the right has not quite figured this out yet. Not just to put money into it, but to do it smartly. And like, I believe in capitalism. These things have to be able to float on their own. So we don't want to just like subsidize these things and start a bunch of nonprofits. Like these products, if they're doing well and making good content, they need to be self-sustaining, but they also need capital to get kickstarted. And it's a different kind of investment that you're making, even if you're making money, when you invest in a 10,000 word piece that a writer puts together over the course of 6 months. That's really expensive. And it's going to, take up 30 pages in your magazine. The return on that is negligible in terms of dollars that brings to your magazine, but you still need to be willing to make that kind of expenditure and that kind of investment in craft if you're ever going to get those writers who, by the way, a lot of them are ideological mercenaries. I know there's this idea that artists are like politically on the left. It's not really true. Most artists just want to tell like good stories, and they're going to do what they have to do to make that happen. We can recruit a lot of these people. So I want to make that pitch. Okay. If you're listening to this, like send me a DM, let's talk. Okay. But also, and I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this. Curtis Yarvin had that piece in the New York Times. They did this big interview with him over the weekend, this big video series. Did you see this?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I was talking about it on Twitter, how funny this is that Curtis Yarvin's in the New York Times and they're doing this big profile.
And give everyone a background on who Curtis is in a nutshell, if you can. Yeah.
So Curtis is America's leading monarchist blogger. He's also he's a technologist. He's a guy who's been writing blogs forever on the right. He's a neo-reactionary, and like, I don't mean that pejoratively. I just mean like that's his like political ideology. He's this really provocative sort of political philosopher who lately has been getting a lot of attention because he's influenced people like J.D. Vance and a lot of this new tech right coalition that has fallen under the MAGA umbrella. So Curtis is this really now sort of interesting, exotic object for people like at the New York Times. I think
he's got some quotes in his back catalog that are admittedly horrendous. So they're also trying to tie him. They're trying to tie him to the administration. The timing was not accidental, right?
No, of course not.
They're trying to say, look, Emperor Trump is listening to, Curtis Yarvin for them is like a Rasputin figure.
Yeah, right? He's like going to be the Dugin that they use to slander him.
Yes.
And J.D. Vance too, because J.D. Vance's future now, the horizon for J.D. Vance is not 4 years, it's 12 years. And I think the New York Times sort of understands that, and these major leftist institutions understand that. So, but my question is, okay, something like this, or if the New York Times comes to you and says, Chris Rufo, you're an important figure on the right, we want to profile you. The New Yorker comes to you and says, Chris Rufo, you're obviously an important figure. We want to profile you. And even let's just make the assumption, which is probably you can't make, but let's just make the assumption that they're going to treat you like relatively fairly. They're just going to sort of accurately quote you. There may be some jabs, but like nothing too critical. Do you think it's a good idea for people on the right, now I'm asking this too because I'm getting some of these inquiries, to participate in this kind of this liberal project to understand the MAGA right by going after these figures and like writing these profiles and trying to get information out of us? On the one hand, like, there's a lot of people on the fence that still look to the New York Times and think that it's an important institution. And the things they hear in the New York Times are what's legitimate in the discourse. And I want to actually recruit them. I want them to be on our side. And I want them to hear what we have to say. On the other hand, I want to starve these people of attention. I know they're not going to treat us well over the long term. They're going to subvert us the moment it becomes convenient for them to do so. They're not our allies, and we need to build up our own sort of discourse communities. So what do you do with the New York Times?
Well, I'm going to actually be at the New York Times next week, and so and of course the hypotheticals that you asked are not hypotheticals. New York Times, New Yorker Magazine, New York Magazine, all of the kind of prestige left magazines in New York have come out to visit me here in Gig Harbor, Washington. At their request and then at my invitation. And in my experience, it's really a kind of low downside risk and a high upside potential. In some ways, I wish it weren't the case. I wish, National Review would send out a reporter and, whatever other kind of conservative magazines. They don't do that. And even if they did do that, the honest truth is that it would not have the impact as, Curtis Yarvin's black and white high contrast face at New York Magazine or New York Times Magazine. And so we have to engage in a dialectic with these folks. We have to engage in a conflict with these folks. And part of conflict is engaging in compromise, negotiation, and limited agreement. And in my experience, a lot of these guys that are field reporters that come out and do profiles are very reasonable. And in private, they'll tell you, I mostly agree with you, but, I'm writing for X, Y, and Z magazine, and so I'm going to have to include a couple jabs in there. But I still think it's worthwhile because whether we like it or not, those are still the kind of markers of the mainstream. And when I see someone like Curtis, and look, I have a kind of personal friendship with Curtis and then also a public ongoing fight with Curtis. But when I see Curtis going into the New York Times, I'm very happy because he's then expanded the range of acceptable discourse as defined by the left. And he makes it easier for us to also expand the range and then position ourselves more to the center. When people are saying, well, it's between, Jamel Bowie, Curtis Yarvin, all of a sudden Christopher Rufo looks very reasonable, very moderate, you know. But if it's between Jamel Bowie and Robin DiAngelo, we have a problem. And so I think even in your case, you should do it. You should be careful. You should run a small hand recorder when these folks interview you as you're building trust with individual reporters. But look, over time, you'll figure out who you can work with, who's trustworthy even in points of disagreement. Mm-hmm. And I think that, again, and it's like almost you hate to say this, you hate to admit it, but the New York Times is the center of gravity for the narrative. And if we're just saying, we give up, we're not going to touch it, or we're too good for it, I think you're missing a huge opportunity, not just personally for you, but also to get the ideas out there and to start contesting, what was previously, I mean, like, I guess we're in like the after woke period, like for 2 weeks. But what was previously the consensus in those places. And look, even if you go back, I read the New York Times coverage of Herbert Marcuse, the Weather Underground, and all of the New Left figures. They were relentlessly mocking these people. Uh-huh. They had profiles of the Weather Underground that called them spoiled brats, total garbage. I mean, it was like they were brutal towards those people because they still had like a strong kind of moderate left, reasonable left. And to the extent that we can also help the New York Times get to that point again, I think it's worthwhile.
Interesting. Okay. I mean, I take your point, and I do think it's true that the New York Times, like we have to just deal in reality. It's not the world we want; it's the world as it is. And the New York Times still has tremendous amount of power to shape the discourse. And to the extent you can get them to open up the Overton window to allow your ideas not just inside, but to be normal, to be the center of MAGA world is a good thing. So I take that point. My counter to that is I don't want to get too far afield here, but like I'm thinking about the H-1B debate. Okay, this is like an important thing that happened over Christmas. We don't need to rehash the whole H-1B debate. That's been beaten into the ground. But the meta aspect of that debate was that it happened entirely on X. It happened entirely outside the constraints of formal media, established media. It was just personalities in this very informal environment of trading tweets, hashing out and negotiating what like the MAGA right and the tech right was going to do about this issue of H-1Bs, to the extent that we know from reporting that came out of the White House affected policy. People actually took that debate seriously, and it's being used to shape policy. And in one case, in Vivek's case, something he said over the course of that debate, which was frankly ill-advised, but nonetheless, just this like, I think he had good intentions with it, but he revealed something about his beliefs that rubbed some people the wrong way. And now he's like out of the White House and he's running for governor in Ohio. So do we need the New York? Like the question then is, do we actually need the New York Times? Can the right just have these conversations amongst ourselves? And I guess maybe I'm answering my own question. In certain contexts, yes. Like when we're debating policy amongst ourselves, then the answer is yes. But there's a broader world out there. The left still does exist. Democrats still do exist. And they're a part of any kind of national conversation. So there are going to be occasions where they have to be addressed as well, I guess.
I mean, look, I love X. I think it is the closest that we get to kind of like the WWF political arena. It's great. It's such a great platform. It's so much better after Elon's takeover.
Amazing.
And it is a place where we can hash out disputes and launch campaigns and establish narratives and influence the coverage at places like, the conservative press, the liberal press.
The New York Times. The New York Times covered the H-1B debate on Twitter.
Exactly, because of what was happening on X. And I think it also, kind of puts a nice button on this question of the cultural right ascendancy. And Vivek Ramaswamy, who I've known for a couple years, and I like him and I respect him, on this case was just like horrifically wrong. And what's so funny is that Vivek is a natural-born salesman. Mm-hmm. I think there is a criticism of Vivek that he sometimes, will reverse his positions or put on a show or say what you want to hear or kind of, sell the snake oil. But actually what got him in trouble was his I think, authentic position, was that American kids are lazy, they're entitled, they're watching Saved by the Bell, they want to be the prom queen or the football star, and they're having too many damn sleepovers, which is preventing them from winning the spelling bee, essentially, which is just like the kind of East Asian, South Asian grind mindset. And I just think that the thing that rubbed people the wrong way, I mean, this is really important. Look, we're in a civilizational competition with Asia. This is a fact. But we have our own unique culture, our own unique way of doing things. And I've lived in China for a year. I've spent 20 years, I've done a dozen trips to China over the last 20 years. There's, of course, interesting things about their civilization, but I mean, this kind of mindless grinding and repetition and recitation and other directed, complete other directedness. It's like maximum super ego, just like, hammering you to study, is not the American way. I mean, we're cowboys, pioneers, frontiersmen, inventors. The Wright brothers were not like grinding away on their abacus when they invented the airplane. No, they were like bicycle mechanics in Ohio who did it through trial and error, experimentation, and invention. And so, while I was in some ways, sad to see Vivek, kind of getting bounced out of Doge and kind of set on a new journey, it was clarifying because this is true. It's like, what kind of right do we want? What kind of culture do we want? We're not going to get a good answer from the New York Times. But we are actually going to get a good answer on X, or at least a good debate. And so in that sense, I think it's a force for good.
It needs to be said, too, that Vivek is just wrong on the facts, okay? Zach Morris got a 1520 on his SATs, and I think Screech got like a 1200.
Is it true?
Okay?
I saw that. Is that a verified fact?
That is part of Saved by the Bell lore here. And so Vivek just totally whiffed on the important question. Jock supremacy, okay? And I say that partially tongue-in-cheek, but not really, because that kind of striverism that you're talking about, that values things like winning the spelling bee are like good for certain kinds of skills, but the sort of American entrepreneurial spirit, the sort of risk-taking and like running towards danger and like doing things just because, and also, the kinds of things you learn, playing football and learning the virtues of loyalty, okay, and teamwork and like knowing your role within the team. And some guys get to score the touchdown, but like the left guard who makes the block is just as important. And like, that's okay. He's not going to have the prettiest girlfriend, but he gets, all the same pats on the back in the locker room afterwards. Like those kinds of things that you learn are more important to American success and America's greatness than studying for the spelling bee. So yeah, it was just like a massive miss that revealed a kind of ignorance, I think, about what actually does make America great. And why that's so important is because what we're negotiating here is what is the spirit of Americanness that we are trying to reassert after these decades, frankly, of demoralization and losing track of who we are. This is like what the left was doing. They were dissembling the notion of what it meant to be an American. It was supposed, like the bottom was just going to drop out. And you saw this when they attack, Mount Rushmore, of all places, or try to take down these statues of our great heroes, as flawed as they may have been, what they're trying to do is dehistoricize like who we are, let the bottom fall out, and then what gets replaced in this sort of year zero is a kind of globalist amalgamation of this vague multiculturalism. And no, what we're saying is no, America is a unique thing. It's real, and it has a past, and it's a very good past, and it's comprised of a lot of different parts and characteristics. But we want to reassert what that American thing was. And so anyway, that's like the broader scope, I think, of the Vivek mistake.
I think that it's like this and this will segue us nicely. It's like this dystopian future of America where the bottom drops out, history is erased, and you have two warring tribes, the kind of genderless, left-wing, activist archetype, and then you have the kind of the striver, engineer, kind of completely uncreative and unindividualistic type. You know, it's like that's the society we don't want on either end. We've got to have that American spirit. And so the last story I want to talk about, and this is one that is coming out of left field for me, for you, I think, and for everyone else. There is a cult. You know, I grew up in Sacramento. You grew up in the East Bay, so we're kind of like we're from the same region, and so you've probably driven through Vallejo many times. Oh, yeah. And there is there's a compound in Vallejo that was essentially occupied by a number of male to female transgender computer scientists who had adopted an ideology of radical rationalism based on some kind of esoteric Silicon Valley ideology. And lo and behold, they've been implicated, or at least allegedly involved, in a string of murders. I mean, in some sense, this is extremely American, right? Religious cults, murder, California. I mean, this is a replay of a lot of the stories that we all know. But there's something really interesting about this. Has this been on your radar? Oh, and if so, you know, what is your take on it? Yeah.
The other, like, they're also part of this like rationalist movement, which is closely related to, you know, these Bay Area sort of intellectual movements, actually kind of adjacent to what like Curtis Yarvin came out of. These like 2010s era bloggers, Elier Yudkowsky, okay, Less Wrong forums. They have since transitioned into AI safety. That's become like the big thing that the rationalists are interested in. And it's this, you know, they're
AI
also
safety is
to,
this
like,
idea that AI will bring an apocalypse. It's like digital climate change, right? Is that the basic?
Thesis? Yeah. There's this Swedish philosopher, Nicholas Bostrom, who, you know, started inventing all these thought experiments about AGI, and like you might have heard of a paperclip maximizer, and you know, it's like, okay, what are we going to do about AI if it exceeds our, you know, own cognitive abilities, et cetera? The singularity, okay, as like an existential event. And there's all these theories around that, and so they're also related to the effective altruists, which is something else, you know, viewers might have heard of, which is the ration, like what we're seeing, and this is like a very 2010s kind of movement, is after the new atheists in the early 2000s, there was this kind of loss of a kind of spiritual life. As we know, though, people need religion in some form. So, like, what fills that God-shaped hole in people's souls? And a lot of these Bay Area types, also highly autistic in many cases, have, like, figured that rationalism is going to solve this problem of God for them. It's going to solve this problem of morals and values. And what this cult, so I only know a little bit about it as well, but their operating sort of moral principle is something they're calling like utilitarian extremism, or like extremist utilitarianism. And they've committed themselves to the variable of suffering of like any conscious creature as the thing that we're trying to like maximally diminish. Like our morality ought to maximally diminish the suffering of like cognizant beings, including animals and plants, even in some cases. And so they're like, you know, they can justify, for example, murdering somebody because the murder of that person, whom let's say eats a lot of hamburgers, is that person's behavior is leading to the suffering of some number of like cows, okay, that taken in aggregate, it has greater moral worth than that person's life. So just killing that person is like a moral act. I mean, these are obviously ideas that are not sustainable over the long term, but are indicative, I think, of something that we've seen before in history, which is as the left burns out of these like various cycles, these cultural cycles, and like wokeism in this case starts to wane, what you see are not just retreats. Mostly it's retreat, but what you also see are sort of like psychotic spasms throughout the culture that often result in violence, like Manson family style violence. So that seems to be what we're dealing with this cult. But what's your take on these people?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that it is a ideological splintering that then gets taken to logical extremes. And what's interesting about this particular story in my mind is that it seems to combine all of the various strands of our current moment. I mean, these people are all, transgender computer scientists, rationalists who are radicalized on a series of, high IQ, high autism blogs. But, two of these members allegedly were involved in the murder of a Border Patrol agent up in the Northeast. And they're involved in a series of murders and counter murders. That was this. They're all connected, allegedly. And murders and counter murders in the Bay Area. Some of them have faked their own deaths and then reemerged. It is this this kind of squirreling away of this energy, and the left can no longer mobilize on a mass scale. That was the lesson that, unfortunately, I spent a lot of money learning. Investigating the DC kind of above ground protest movement. But this is kind of where it goes next. And you have a lot of psychological instability, ideological instability, when you bring those two things, pharmaceutical instability in these cases, like loading people up with hormones. And then on top of that, it's this idea that, maximum rationality leads to kind of a death cult is like so poetic. It couldn't be more, it couldn't be a better reveal. And that's kind of my fear as we ride into like the reascendance of like yuppies. And probably you were this way. Tell me if you weren't, but growing up, I was like, some of my friends or like parents were like yuppies, and I really like looked down on them. I didn't like them. I was like, oh, this is because like, awful, banal way of living, and now I'm like, dear God, please bring this back as just like the norm. These people are amazing. The guy who runs, your local business, whatever. It's like, let's say this yuppie, renewed Gilded Age, let's say, comes back as the dominant culture. You're going to have this as the underpinning. We saw it with Luigi Mangione, who killed the CEO. Yeah. We saw it with this so-called Zizian cult in Vallejo. We see it with some of the school shooters, like the transgender school shooter in Nashville. And the terrifying thing about it is that there is essentially nothing that you can do in all of these cases. I mean, of course, you can do things, you can have law enforcement, et cetera, but these things have to just burn out. Yeah, it's an unfortunate reality.
So there's like the top layer that's going to get all the headlines, the violence, okay, and that's one way that this is going to burn out. But what we're dealing with, you and I have talked a lot about this, is kind of mass psychogenic illness. Okay, what we're experiencing in the culture writ large is a mental health crisis that not just the individual scale, but at the scale of like people running institutions, is creating all sorts of pathologies in the culture and sort of undermining the effectiveness of these institutions and turning them away from what their goals ought to be, et cetera. Okay, so you're going to have a bunch of psychopaths who end up committing violence or doing like really awful things. There's a layer below that, though, which is just like your average DEI person. Okay, you're like some lady with her, problem glasses and like, she's got her whatever. This lady, if you grew up in Northern California anywhere, and she's in charge of some NGO, or she's running some like public health agency somewhere. She's at like Kaiser Hospital running their trans program. Okay, whoever this woman is. And like there's thousands.
I've dated this woman. I dated this woman in my 20s for sure. Many of them.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It's a good lesson to learn. But like, okay, so you know, DEI gets cut. There's this radical sort of cultural pushback against all this stuff. But unfortunately, a lot of these women, for example, maybe right now they're like entering into, you know, postmenopausal phase or something. Okay, sorry, you know, or they don't have kids. There's like no obvious way. They're not going to commit a lot of violence, but there's no obvious like path to sublimate this pathological, you know, illness, this ideological illness that they've been carrying around for the last 10 years, and on the basis of which they sort of understand themselves and their status. And so, like, the question I have is actually, what happens to all these people? Like, I worked in academia. I went and looked on my college website this morning, actually, to see if there was any change in the DEI page. I noticed a lack of events. There's no events scheduled for February, so make of that what you will. But it's still there. I know that office houses and employs, you know, maybe 36 people or so, maybe more. And, you know, again, there's thousands of these people. What happens to all these people?
It's such a great question, and actually very relevant. A friend who is a technology investor sent me a text this morning on the same topic. He said, hey, Trump is apparently letting go of 15,000 transgender military service members. Right. And he says, hey, what are we doing to reintegrate these folks? And he sent me some screenshots of the problem with debathification. Meaning when the U.S. government took over Iraq and fired all the regime officials, then scattered them to the winds, they didn't reintegrate them, and they ended up creating violent insurgencies. And he says, look, this is not a specious comparison. Like, you're going to have, potentially, if that's what is happening, it's not clear exactly the status, but you're going to have 15,000 armed, trained, transgender military officials. What is to prevent them from splitting into this kind of Zizian cult-like atmosphere? And then you go down the kind of list of extremity to the Kaiser Permanente gender-affirming care lady. You know, there's a temptation to say, well, not my problem, you know. These are their choices. They have to deal with it. Yeah. But it is our problem. Yeah. And so I don't know. I mean, do they reabsorb into the economy elsewhere? Do they?
I mean, Chris,
detransition?
Okay.
I mean, yeah.
This is
okay. Good. This is what it's all been. It's been leading up to this moment, and
we spent an hour. Okay, waiting to get to this.
You spent more than an hour, because tell us also what you did in preparation for coming on today, related to Panda Express.
I tried. Yesterday, I drove to my local Panda Express, which is, like, by the way, like an hour drive from where I am. I live in the middle of nowhere. And it's this huge, long line, and nobody behind the counter speaks any English. And I didn't want to, like, wait in line with the food people. So I'm, like, trying to, like, point at her hat, like, can I buy the hat? She goes, no, I don't understand. Like, you cannot have my hat. I'm like, no, I don't want your hat.
Are these Asians or Latinos? What are they?
Yeah, I think Latino, but like, I don't want to say for sure, but I'm pretty sure Latino. Yeah.
Okay.
So I tried to get a hat, and like, she wouldn't. I don't think she fully understood what I was asking for. Because she kept saying, like, no, you can't have my hat. This is, like, my work hat. But they wouldn't sell me a hat. I wanted a hat. I mean, I'm sort of half serious. Like, do these people get jobs at like, Panda Express? Maybe, but probably not. There has to be a way to reintegrate these people. And, you know, I don't, or even like look at what's happening with federal workforce. Okay, Trump just offered a severance for, you know, every single federal employee, I think, or a huge percentage of them. Let's say a handful take him up on the offer, and this starts happening in states, like even, you know, let's say conservative states around the country. Like, there's a huge. I saw something on Twitter that when you add up not just the federal workforce, but the NGOs that depend on federal money, grant money, to survive, you could be talking about potentially upwards of like 20 to 25% of our entire labor force. Okay. Yeah. That's a broken economy, first of all. That's not a sustainable economy, I don't think. But then secondly, if we are going to make some serious cuts to our national workforce, what do we do with these people? Maybe that's just an open-ended question. Maybe that's something we got to think really long and hard about. But no, we can't just say this is not our problem. These people are going to end up in education, teaching our kids, or providing whatever services need to be provided to help our lives just sort of facilitate public life. And without a serious accounting of the damage that these ideologies have done, I think we run into the problem of this just reasserting itself 8 years from now. What I want to see, I think we need to have like a national reckoning. I'm serious, like the Smithsonian
Truth and Reconciliation Committee. Yeah.
The Smithsonian, we should have a like current year exhibit. Current year just meaning like, the last decade. And it's all the absurdities over that time. Like I remember this picture of like Lizzo with her diamond encrusted flute. And it's like Jazz Jennings in his mermaid costume.
Yes.
And just it could be like video, like libs of TikTok, just like a hour long, like on a loop. And when you walk through the Smithsonian, this is like what you see. We have to be reminded. I really think this is important for us to be reminded just how psychotic this period of American history was, and also to apply shame to people for holding these beliefs. And I think over some amount of time, that will work. That does serve as a deterrent for people to get recaptured by this same kind of ideological zeal. So I'm like only half kidding. I actually think this would work.
Well, I think two things. One is you're talking about almost like an ideological detransition.
Yeah.
It's like a mass detransition as far as these ideologies go.
I want them to be embarrassed.
It's a truth and reconciliation. But I think your point about the Smithsonian is actually a very serious one and actually a very good one. Why can't we put together some of our friends to force the Smithsonian to do it?
We can.
We could do a museum exhibit, a kind of tunnel through the last 10 years, a decade retrospective with multimedia, libs of TikTok, on loop, some cool video installation art, some kind of blowing up photographs or kind of digitally rendered paintings of some of the key scenes, like the BLM people screaming at that woman in the table.
Yes,
I mean, visual representation of all this. We'll get that guy, the sculptor guy who's on Twitter to make a sculpture. I mean, this is actually exactly how we should be thinking. And well, I know you and I have many things to do throughout the week. I mean, why can't we do this?
We should.
Why can't we need to actually just say, hey, we're in charge now. These are our public institutions too. We don't want to have another, transgender mermaid installation. We're going to do something that we want to do.
I remember early on, I think this was before we knew each other, you were putting out like K through 12, like curriculum that people would send you. So it'd be like, San Diego School District, and they would send you something. And you would see like, teacher, and it'd be like in bold letters, like about, white people's like pineal glands are too calcified to like properly teach like, Hispanic students and like and this isn't just some random teacher. This was like the, vice principal of the school or something.
Yeah.
And it's like, we cannot forget these documents. It's important. It's not just the crazy activists. The people who need to remember this are like the people at the New York Times and the readers of the New York Times who consented to all of this and let it happen. And what I'm seeing is their attempt to extricate themselves from this history. So, I listened to these like New York Times podcasts, and it was either Cottle or Carlos Lozado. They do this, weekly podcast, and they were like, talking about Robin DiAngelo. and how absurd Robin DiAngelo was in this
God,
book.
yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I read this for the first time, and this was just, I can't believe how crude and vulgar some of these ideas were. And it's like, are you kidding me? You're going to sit here now and pretend as if this whole time you and your company weren't participating in this mania? And no, they should not be allowed to extricate themselves. They need to remember. It's like, the scene in Clockwork Orange, like the speculum on their eyes, where they have to like see these images and the things that they consented to. So yeah, I do think this is important. I think it's important. And by the way, the left does this all the time. The left takes moments in history that are advantageous to them, either because it discredits people on the right or amplifies their own virtue, and they create monuments to these things. They do it all the time. The right does not participate in that kind of cultural information space, and we should. And we should use the Smithsonian and the tools available to us to make people see this stuff.
Yeah, I think we should. And in the coming weeks, we should talk to some of the guys that are coming in on Trump's culture team, and perhaps slice out some budget for this, because I think you're absolutely right. We have to have it. It has to be grand in scale. It has to be a kind of an interesting experience for people. And it's something that I think would wake a lot of people up, where it's saying, actually, no, you're playing nice now, but this is what you put the country through for 10 years. And we're not going to let you forget it. And we're actually we're going to erect a monument to your madness in your own house. That's what it's all about. And so we will forcibly, we're going to seize the Smithsonian. There's going to be tanks on the National Mall, and then we'll go from there.
And legally. Peacefully and legally. We're centrist now. This is, but I mean that
These
seriously.
are metaphorical tanks that are actually hologram art. But that's
tanks
right.
of the mind, tanks of the spirit, okay?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Tanks of the mind and tanks of the soul. Okay, well, that is a great place to end up, and I love your proposal. And so everyone should, once again, check out Passage Press, buy some books, buy Curtis Yarvin's book, buy Nick Land's book, buy everybody's book.
Buy the books, buy the magazine, subscribe to Man's World. It's all happening.
It's all happening, man. Okay, well, until next time, it's been a pleasure, and we'll see you soon.
All right. Thanks, Chris.